Okay, so section 2 of reaching a verdict, which is witness appeal. So this is all about how can you make your witness appeal more to the jury. So first of all, attractiveness, witness confidence, and then the effect of shields and videotape. So first of all, attractiveness. So there's Harry Styles, accused of stealing a koala bear. He potentially would get away with it more than Shane MacGowan, even though Shane MacGowan is the better musician. So it would be a travesty of justice. But because in society we tend to place more, we place a halo around good-looking people, and we demonize and we make into the devil the ugly people, then we tend to believe in the courtroom people like Harry more than Shane. Okay, so that is the key terms for the background. There you go. Good guys and bad guys. The media portrays that. Films portray that as the more attractive good guys. The halo effect is what it's known as, a cognitive bias towards them. And juries are less likely to convict them. Judges are less likely to give long sentences. Even if a good-looking person's been found guilty, the judge often gives less of a sentence. So Pennington and Segal and Ostrov were the ones to investigate this. Straightforward study. Burglary or fraud. Okay, and we have two conditions of attractive and not attractive. So, lab experiment with 120 participants who were mock jurors, and information was delivered by by a tape recorder. Each participant was presented with information on a small card about a crime, either burglary or fraud, and told that there was no doubt that the individual was guilty. Okay, they're not deciding guilt or innocence here. They are deciding a length of a sentence. Recommend a suitable sentence. So we've got three different conditions where information was presented about the criminal, about what they had done, about their crime, but there was no photo attached. In the other conditions, it was the same information, but with a photo of an attractive woman, and then the same information with a photo of an unattractive woman. Okay, so it's the same information in all three, but you've either got a photo attractive or unattractive. And the other two conditions were either for burglary or for fraud. So, results, jurors gave an average of 5.2 years when there was an unattractive photo, but 2.8, look at that, you could spend another couple of years in prison just for not being attractive. 4.45 years for fraud, but 4.35 years for the unattractive photo. So the interesting thing that's gone on here is that when it's for a case like fraud, the attractive person is actually punished by the judge or the jury, whereas if they're unattractive, they don't get as much of a sentence. So perhaps we feel somehow betrayed by good-looking people who have all that going for them, yet they use those looks to their advantage in taking advantage of people in fraud. Whereas in burglary, we don't care as much. We'll send them to jail for less amount of time because they're attractive. Okay, so there's interesting psychological components going on there. So conclusion, attractiveness of accused affects length of sentence, but is dependent on the type of crime. Perhaps jurors believe the attractive offenders use their looks to their advantage in fraud, creating lower morality. Perhaps they deserve a longer sentence. Okay, so straightforward. 2.2 is witness confidence. And again, straightforward. If you are a lawyer, what do you tell your witness to be? According to this study, tell them to be confident. No matter what, tell them to get on that stand and be confident. Why? Because giving evidence is very nerve-wracking. People do get very nervous. So when a jury sees someone get up there who is really confident in those awkward circumstances, they tend to start thinking they're a reliable witness and what they're saying is absolutely true. Unfortunately, though, that isn't always the case. It isn't just because you are 100% confident, you can still be 100% wrong, as we know from Loftus's research. So, problem is that they may appear more confident due to the way their evidence has been processed, such as how they are interviewed by the police and how well they've been prepared in advance. So, a good lawyer will get them to be very confident and psych them up for the case, but it doesn't mean that they're going to be any more accurate. So how did they investigate that? Penrod and Cutler, 95. Several different factors relating to eyewitness confidence and jury decisions. So they manipulated loads of things. Mock trial with independent measures. Participants shown a videotape of a trial of a robbery. Okay, videotape of a trial. In America, you can film courtrooms. So after the video, participants were asked to decide whether the defendant was guilty or not guilty. 10 variables were manipulated through the film so they were seen at a high or low level. So what were those 10 variables? And bear in mind before I show you these, most of these didn't count. It was only the witness confidence that actually had an impact. So this is just out of interest. What were the 10? Whether the suspect was heavily or minimally disguised, whether they had 2 or 14 days between the robbery and the evidence, whether the witness was 80% or 100% confident about their identification, and that's the one that ends up having the effect, not to give away the results or anything. So for 9 out of the 10 variables, it made no difference to the verdicts given. But when the witness was 100% confident, the participant gave a guilty verdict 67% of the time, whereas if they said they were 60%, if they said they were only 80% certain, that dropped to 60% of the time of guilty verdicts. So that's the only thing that even though it's a small difference, it was regarded as significant. And in a follow-up study, Penrod and Cutler looked at other cases, looked at past cases, and found that it's true. How confident you are doesn't mean that you're right. But if you're a lawyer, you want to get your witnesses 100% confident because it does sway them a little bit. Okay, so conclusions. The more confident a witness, the more convincing they are, and this affects the verdict given. It's more likely to go in the order that you want it to. How accurate the witness is does not matter, only how confident they are. So that's not encouraging for justice, really, is it? But there we go. Okay, section 2.3 is the effects of shields and videotape on children giving evidence. In this grainy picture here, there's a TV. They can give evidence from behind a TV, or they can give evidence from behind a shield, so behind just a curtain. The aim of that is so that young children don't have to sit in front of the person who they're accusing. So it could be a sexual crime, or it could be a very violent crime, and they're scared of the person, so they don't want to go to court. The Criminal Justice Act in 1988 allowed a child to give evidence on video from a different room, and in 1991 that was changed so that the evidence from an initial police interview could be used if it was done properly, and that video footage could be used in court. And in addition, judges were required to warn jurors of the dangers of believing children's evidence. So, not surprisingly, not many children used to go forward, and there was very low conviction rates in things like child abuse cases. So it's a big important thing that Ross and their researchers were looking at. It was, does it make a difference if you're giving evidence behind a protective shield? Does it discredit you rather than you being in open court? So examine the effects of conviction rates if the children give evidence in a sexual abuse case in court, or with a protective shield, or via videotape. So does it cause the jury to experience credibility inflation or deflation, which means do they become more credible as a witness, or do they become less credible as a witness? So method: 2-hour video of a simulation of a sexual abuse trial, recreated using actual court transcripts, so from actual court transcripts, which is very good. The IV was the way in which the victim, a 10-year-old girl, gave her evidence. Was it from court, directly confronting the defendant, in the courtroom, but with a protective shield, or giving her evidence on a video? Okay, so nice, clear. There was no significant difference between the conditions of the IV in terms of the number of guilty verdicts, but there was a significant difference in terms of males and females, and we'll deal with that second. Percentage of guilty verdicts. This is a good example of a study where even though you find no significant difference, it doesn't mean you haven't found anything. This is great news. This means that children can give evidence behind a shield. They don't have to face the person who had attacked them. So that's great news that it doesn't actually create any credibility inflation or deflation. But what was interesting about it was the females of the study were more likely to give a guilty verdict in this sexual abuse case. So 58.6 females compared to 38.6 males, which is a huge difference. So, it's interesting. Why is that? Females found the defendant less credible and the child witness more credible. Now, the child was female, so maybe they just had more empathy. Maybe it would have been the opposite if males had been watching a child who was male. But that was a very interesting secondary finding, that. So the two conclusions: evidence given by children isn't affected by the method used to give their evidence, but women are more likely to give guilty verdicts in a child sex abuse case than men. Okay, section 3, reaching a verdict. It's called reaching a verdict. The whole thing's called reaching a verdict because it's about in the jury room. And if you watch 12 Angry Men, it's all about in that room. Stages and influences on decision making is 3.1. Majority influence, and then minority influence. So, the case of Rodney King, have a read of that. It's essentially a guy who was quite blatantly beaten up by police officers, but was ended up, and it was caught on videotape, but was tried in a predominantly white area where lots of police officers lived, and he was amazingly found. The police were found not guilty, which shocked America. So, what had gone on in that jury room? So stages and influences. Each juror needs to make sense of the information they're being presented with, and so they can get their head around it. There's a lot that goes on in the courtroom. It's very complicated, and so what goes on in those jurors' heads, that's what they're trying to answer with this section. So once all the evidence and witnesses have been heard from the jury, they retire into the deliberation room, and then they follow the process. And what is it? They appoint a full person to begin with, so they decide who's going to be in charge out of the 12 of them, and then they have an initial vote to establish whether they're guilty or not guilty. Then they have a review of the evidence, and then they apply the law to the evidence to try and figure out. So for example, is it they try and figure out a story of what's happened, and they say, was it manslaughter, was it murder, for example. And no, it's impossible for researchers to observe this process because researchers aren't allowed into that. No one is allowed into that jury room other than the jurors. Okay, so Pennington Hasty's story model, so same Pennington Hasty as before, but they wanted to formulate a theory and account of the way that they make decisions in trials, and they hypothesized that jurors try to make sense of the evidence and impose their own story on the information that they're given. So they might make assumptions at the start of what's gone on in this case, and then every piece of evidence that comes to them, they try and fit it to it. So they decide very quickly, for example, maybe it was the wife that murdered them, and if they formulate that, then they try and fit the story to fit with that. In a trial, the prosecution and defence teams are trying to construct different stories, so the task of the jury is to try and reconcile the stories of the prosecution and defence with their own versions and what's in their heads. So it's Bartlett, who's a big psychology memory guy, who proposed that we reconstruct evidence to make sense of it, and that we use schema, which are rules that we already know of in our memory, and earlier associations when assimilating new information. For example, if I say to you manslaughter and murder, you might already have ideas of the difference between manslaughter and murder. And when you're given new information in a courtroom, when you're sat there as a juror, you might start assimilating that, so fitting that into your preconceived ideas of what murder and manslaughter is. The problem is, your idea of what murder and manslaughter might not be what the actual law is. So that can produce lots of problems. But they essentially, and you'd be describing these in the exam, the 3 stages: orientation period, different opinions raised. So in that jury room, you sit there, different opinions are brought up, they raise questions, they explore facts in relaxed and open discussions, and they set an agenda. Okay, then open confrontation. I think he's guilty, you think he's innocent, you have lots of debate, and you put pressure on the minority, you put pressure on people who don't agree with you, just like in 12 Angry Men. And then reconciliation, you attempt to smooth over conflict, and that's often done through humour. So then you've all been embarrassed about this conflict you're having with complete strangers, and then you smooth over it later. Okay. Now, in terms of writing about it in the exam,